The government flags a pay rise for award workers and the new Greens leader outlines a new vision. I'm Pablo Vinales, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Labor has recommended a wage increase above the rate of inflation for some of Australia's lowest paid workers. But does it go far enough and is it sustainable? We'll ask Employment Minister Amanda Rishworth in just a moment. The Greens leader says the party can pursue environmental reform while also prioritising housing and healthcare. Can they juggle competing priorities in the Senate? We'll put that question to the party's Deputy Leader Mehreen Faruqi. The acting Prime Minister is confident Labor will meet its 2030 renewable energy target. But is the plan on track? We'll find out how the energy transition is going on in one of the country's most historic coal mining regions. Economically sustainable. That's how Labor is describing its submission to the Fair Work Commission, recommending a pay rise for Australians on award wages. It's aimed at boosting the wages of cleaners, retail workers and early childhood educators, which the government says amounts to about 3 million Australians. Treasurer Jim Chalmers says the increase would not be inflationary.
The most important feature of today's submission is we are seeking an economically sustainable real wage increase for Australians on awards. Now, this is all about ensuring that 3 million Australians can get the decent pay that they need and deserve to provide for their loved ones. We're very proud to be making this submission today because it builds on the progress that we have made together when it comes to wages and jobs. Now, this submission is responsible, it is fair and it's consistent with our efforts to provide tax cuts for every Australian taxpayer as well.
The Treasurer was also on the defence about proposed changes to superannuation tax. The government is seeking to increase the tax rate for people with superannuation balances over $3 million from 15% to 30%. Labor Party President and Chair of Superfund CBUS, Wayne Swan, told Nine self-managed funds had become a tax avoidance mechanism.
You're talking about a lot of money and there's a lot of funds with that amount of money in it as well. So the government shouldn't be giving concessions to people who have many millions of dollars squirreled away well before retirement to engage in other investment activities. They should be paying the appropriate tax on those funds. That is normal for any business activity.
Labor MP Amanda Rishworth was named as the new Employment and Workplace Relations Minister following a cabinet reshuffle by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese earlier this week and has been busily reading up on her new portfolio ahead of the award wages announcement today. She joined us earlier. Amanda Rishworth, welcome to the program and congratulations on the new appointment.
Well, thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here with you.
Let's get straight into your new portfolio. The federal government has recommended the Commission award an economically sustainable real wage increase to Australia's award workers. So last year, the Fair Work Commission granted a 3.75% increase. How much of an increase is economically sustainable, do you think, now?
Well, look, what we've got to do and what we've done is delivered on our election commitment, which was to put a submission into the Fair Work Commission. Of course, the Fair Work Commission will make an independent decision, but what we're saying is that many of our low-paid workers are still feeling cost of living pressures, and that's why we would like to see a real wage increase. But obviously, that needs to be done in the context of economic conditions. And so we've put forward, though, a very principled position that there needs to be a real wage increase for Australia's lowest paid workers because they are doing it tough still under cost of living pressures.
So the government's obviously, as you say, pushing for a wage increase above inflation. So what do you say to employer groups like the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry that are pushing for an increase of around 2.5 to 2.6%? They point to steep rises in costs for businesses. Is that adequate?
Well, firstly, I would say any party is able to put an application into the Commission From the government's perspective, though, we want our low-paid workers to know we've got their back. When you look across the economic conditions, we still see low unemployment, historically low unemployment. We're also seeing inflation coming down into the Reserve Bank band, which is also a very important condition. So we do think there is a case for a real wage increase to our lowest paid workers, but that will be a matter for the Commission.
Do you think the economic conditions we're seeing in Australia are looking more promising for a sustainable wage growth in the years ahead? Obviously, we are seeing inflation coming down. Do you think workers can feel confident in that?
Well, look, what I would say is that there have been some pleasing numbers coming out this week, economic numbers. We've seen real wages grow again with the annual wage increase at 3.4%, which is higher than CPI. We've also seen one of those historically low unemployment numbers at 4.1, and we've seen really significant jobs growth in the March to April month. Over 89,000 jobs added to the economy. So there is, and of course, inflation reducing. So these are promising, but we do know that people are still doing it tough, and that is why our government has been absolutely focused on, through the election period, but now we're in government again, on how we reduce those cost pressures on people and how we support people with cost of living.
How much uncertainty or concern do you have when you look at the economic outlook? It's looking very uncertain on the global stage, and whether that could obviously impact inflation here, and therefore these sort of projections or these hopes that you have around a real wage increase?
Well, look, obviously, we are not immune to global factors. Partly, we've seen as a result of this global inflation environment that have an impact on Australia. But our government is doing absolutely everything we can to make sure that we're putting downward pressure on inflation, but also supporting people with cost of living. And that's exactly what this submission to the Fair Work Commission is designed to do. But we're not immune, but as a government, we're working every single day to support Australians with some of these cost of living pressures, acting responsibly by making sure that we keep being responsible around our budget settings and really continuing to put that downward pressure on inflation. We're seeing inflation come down, and we'll continue to obviously monitor the global results.
Now, last month we also saw the Fair Work Commission recommend pay rises of up to 30% to hundreds of thousands of early childhood workers and health professionals. It's in response to trying to address the gender pay gap in highly feminised industries, and it's been seen as a landmark decision. Is this one you welcome?
Well, we certainly welcome the work done by the Commission when it comes to reducing the gender pay gap. This has been a significant issue, and it's why the government put gender equality as an object of the Fair Work Act. Of course, when it comes to early childhood educators, we as a government have already taken steps to look at how we can better remunerate early childhood educators through our worker retention payment that has been operating since December. But we certainly have been very, very focused as a government on how we reduce the gender pay gap, and we'll continue to do so. What
do you say, though, to some of the private health operators that argue that this would blow out costs for smaller clinics? It could lead to job losses and higher fees for clients that are worried about having to pass this down.
Well, look, this Commission decision is that it's a decision that they're now consulting on. But more broadly as a principle, reducing the gender pay gap is a really important issue in this country and something that our government has taken very seriously. We are seeing, for example, when it comes to the jobs figures for March to April, of the new jobs created, 65,000 of those were taken up by women. So women's workforce participation, reducing the gender pay gap is really important, not just for those women, but for our economy as well. So look, obviously that is a decision for Fair Work, but as a broad principle, we certainly are very committed to how we reduce the gender pay gap in this country.
More broadly, in your new portfolio, what is the aim for you in trying to achieve in this position? You spoke about the gender pay gap. What else do you hope to achieve?
Well, look, first and foremost, my commitment is about making sure we fulfil our election commitments. And the first of those was to put a submission into the Fair Work award wages decision. But in addition to that, we've been really clear that we want to legislate to protect penalty rates in awards. It was a key commitment during the election, and also to ban non-compete clauses for low and middle income earners. Those that, and when it comes to that, that is holding back workers being able to move to other employers and to be able to earn more money. It's holding wages back. And so that is also a real priority of mine.
Minister Rishworth, just before we let you go, I want to ask you on Labor's planned extra tax on superannuation savings for people with savings worth more than $3 million. We have seen some backlash, not just from the opposition, but from a number of Teal independents that say that this will have unintended consequences. The Treasurer insists that the government will push ahead with this. What do you say to some of those concerns that this will unfairly impact self-managed retirees?
Well, what I would say is that our proposal is to reduce what are very generous tax concessions for balances of over $3 million. There will still be concessions on those balances. They won't be as generous as the current setting. This affects only a very small proportion of people. The vast majority of people will not be affected by this, but this is a responsible measure to ensure that we get the balance right. But what I would say is that there will still be tax concessions. They just aren't going to be as generous for those with a balance of over $3 million. So it's the responsible pathway to take. And the method we're using was recommended by Treasury in terms of how we proceed with this.
So there's no room for negotiation here. The government's going to go ahead with this.
Well, look, this has been on the table for some time, and we will continue to prosecute the case that this is a reasonable change to our superannuation system.
Amanda Rishworth, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The new leader of the Greens did the media rounds this morning after being elected unopposed yesterday to replace Adam Bandt, who lost his seat at the federal election. She says the Greens is not a one-policy party, although the environment remains a focus.
Well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We've always had a broad policy platform. I mean, we've always been about the planet. We're the Greens, the clue's in the name.
Because it didn't feel like it was number one in the recent campaign.
Look, we've always had a number of priorities. Climate and nature is at our core. And as an environmental lawyer, certainly that's what drove me to want to get into politics and try to help fix things. But we've got to make sure that people have their daily needs met. We're a wealthy country. We shouldn't have 1 in 6 kids living in poverty. We should make sure that everyone can get world-class education and the healthcare that they need, whenever they need it, wherever they live. Those basic things are really important. But we can do all of that and protect nature and biodiversity.
Senator Mehreen Faruqi will remain in the role as Deputy Leader of the Greens, and she joins me now. Senator Mehreen Faruqi, thank you for your time and congratulations on your reappointment as Deputy Leader.
Thank you so much, Pablo, and lovely to be with you.
Your new leader has promised a firm but constructive approach in this term of Parliament. Despite the national vote for the Greens holding up at the election, it was a disappointing result. Your former leader lost the seat of Melbourne, the seat of Brisbane and Griffith. Is this a concession that Larissa Waters has made, that perhaps the approach taken at the last election wasn't effective?
Could I just start by saying how delighted I am that Larissa is the leader of the Greens, and there are two women for the first time at the helm of the Greens ship as leader and deputy leader, and two women who one is an environmental lawyer and one is an environmental engineer, and we are ready. We are ready to represent the community who has voted for us in the millions. And you know what? We have the trust of those millions of people who have put us in the sole balance of power in the Senate. And I think one thing that became very clear from the election result is that there are tens of thousands of voters who have voted for the Greens for the first time in areas and communities that had not done that before, and these are migrant and multicultural communities. So they have backed us and they have put us in there to hold the Labor government to account. And that will take many shapes and forms. Of course, we will work constructively and cooperatively when needed. But we will also fight for people and the planet when needed. That's what people are asking us to do.
But do you think you were perhaps a little bit too obstructive in the last Parliament? We saw Labor campaign quite heavily, even language like referring to the Greens political party, really trying to paint you and the party as blockers in the Senate.
Of course, Labor pushed that narrative, but, that is not the truth of the situation. We saw how people were struggling under the cost of living crisis, how people were struggling in the housing crisis and the climate crisis. And, we had to care for people and the planet. So, we negotiated till till Labor listened to us. And then when we saw that things weren't going to change under this Labor government, we kind of agreed with them at that end, but we did get a lot of concessions from Labor as well. The $3.5 billion in community and social housing is something that would not have happened if we hadn't put pressure on Labor. And also because of the pressure we put on Labor for the last 3 years and even beyond that, on student debt, for instance, on wiping all student debt, on making price gouging illegal for supermarkets, and on free GPs. Because of the Greens' pressure, Labor took on those policies, and I think the first cab off the rank in the next Parliament should be for Labor to do that work, and we are ready and willing to do that.
What are some of the lessons, though, for you and for the party from the election result?
Well, we will be doing a detailed evaluation of the election result. And of course, there have been highs and there have been lows. We've lost wonderful, wonderful colleagues and representatives of their communities. And we will, where changes need to be made, we will make those changes. But I think we need to wait to see the detailed evaluation, because I think it was quite complex and nuanced how the election played out. Like I said, it's been bittersweet for us, losing those lower house seats, but then getting sole balance of power in the Senate and tens of thousands of people in migrant and multicultural communities really backing our stance on, the cost of living crisis, on our strong stand against the genocide in Gaza and against racism.
You mentioned the war in Gaza there. Of course, Israel strenuously denies that it is a genocide in Gaza. On those comments, though, you and Larissa Waters both backed in those comments that you've been making over the past couple of years in that situation in the Middle East. Are you comfortable with where the public debate is and how that sort of played out in the domestic scene?
Pablo, our position against a genocide in Gaza is not a position taken because we would win votes or lose votes.
But what about the tactics that the Greens did use through the course of the campaign?
Honestly, I couldn't sleep at night if the Greens hadn't spoken up in the strongest way against the massacre of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of innocent people who are now being starved. There were 100 people in Gaza that were murdered last night. So we took a strong moral position and a position of justice, and we will not back away from that.
Do you think the Greens have veered too much away from some of its core issues? We heard Larissa Waters say that the hint was in the name. And can we expect the party to focus a lot more on the environment in this parliament?
Well, we know that people want this parliament to protect our endangered species. They want us to protect our oceans, our native forests. People don't want to see the destruction of the environment or species going extinct to line the pockets of coal and gas companies. The Greens have always focused on the environment and other things as well. Like I took my cue from Bob Brown, honestly, the strongest voice for justice for refugees many years ago. So these issues, social justice issues and environmental justice issues, are completely interlinked. There can be no climate justice without social justice, without economic justice, or without racial justice. So we will continue on with that. Of course, we saw in the last parliament that Labor did not actually take strong action on the environment or on climate. Rather, we have the highest emissions, or emissions went higher than they were under Scott Morrison. We had weaker environmental laws than were under Scott Morrison. So we need to make sure that in this parliament, Labor, who has the opportunity to work with us, which could be one of the most progressive parliaments and where the strongest action on climate and environment will be taken. And we will not apologize for pushing Labor and fighting for the strongest action on climate and the environment, but also on issues of housing, education and health.
On Labor's nature positive laws, how much does the changing leadership now with Minister Murray Watt in that portfolio affect negotiations, and also with a change with Larissa Waters?
Well, we saw what happened last time when, Prime Minister Albanese dumped the nature positive laws at the behest of the coal and gas companies. So we have to wait and see, what comes back, and we'll sit down as a party and decide, what are these laws that we want to push. Of course, for us, it is always the strongest protection for the environment. We'll wait and see what the minister has to do and say. But like I said before, we will work constructively where needed, and we will fight where needed, because the planet and people cannot wait for tinkering around the edges. We need strong action. We need action which is bold, which is hopeful, and which is transformative.
Okay, Senator Mehreen Faruqi, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Pablo.
On a lighter note, it's well known Anthony Albanese is a dog lover, but it turns out he's a cat lover too. The Indonesian president has published this video online of his much-loved cat Bobby meeting the PM. Bobby got a good pat and a neckerchief that says Australia loves Indonesia, and a feed from the PM too. The PM's also shared a photo of his dog Toto wearing a matching red neckerchief that says Toto loves Bobby. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but let's unpack the last couple of weeks. It's obviously been 2 weeks since the federal election. The final leadership struggle has been decided. The Greens were obviously the last to name their leader, and Labor has also unveiled its front bench earlier in the week. So to discuss this and more, we're joined by Chief Political Correspondent for Guardian Australia, Tom McElroy, and political reporter at The Nightly, Ellen Ransley.
Word neckerchief, you delivered it very well. I think they're laying it on pretty thick with the Indonesians, and it seems like it's working. There seems to be good rapport between Prabowo and the PM in Jakarta this week. Yeah,
I struggled a bit with neckerchief, but going more to the substance, Ellen, how significant do you think this trip has been for the Prime Minister? He made the point that he wanted it to be his first since being re-elected.
Yeah, it's incredibly significant. I mean, it's no accident that it was the first trip Indonesia is one of our most important allies. It's, it's one of our largest neighbours. It will be one of the 5th biggest economies in the world in coming years. And also we saw Indonesia enter the federal election campaign. Indonesia, as a non-aligned country, does have a relationship with Russia and China, and that is of concern to the Australian government. They want Australia to be the security partner of choice to Indonesia, and a lot of this was about making sure Indonesia knows that they have us to rely on. They don't need to turn to Moscow or to Beijing.
Yeah, it was quite a significant point that he made that his first trip. Let's go to the Liberal leadership. We knew it would be a 2-cornered contest, so no great surprises there. But Tom, Susan Lee, she is now obviously the Liberal leader, and she says that firstly she's going to change the tone of the leadership. What do we know about her and how she might take this approach?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how changing the tone works. Obviously, she's quite a different person from Peter Dutton. I've been impressed by the backstory that we've learned from Susan Lee this week. A migrant story coming to Australia from England as a teenager. She has raised her family in rural settings, went to university as a mature age student with a baby on her knee, and has worked pretty hard. Obviously, we've known her in politics for a long time, but I think her life experiences could become a real asset to her as she seeks to kind of build out her image with voters.
She did really try and emphasise her regional upbringing and her background, but we know that the Liberals lost a lot in the cities as well. Do you think that's something that she needs to, I guess, work on?
There's no question that the way back to government for the Liberals and for the coalition more broadly is to win metropolitan seats, and some of their real talent has been wiped out in places like Sydney and Melbourne. It could be a challenge for her, but I think she probably has the opportunity to present a softer image than Peter Dutton, perhaps a little bit more urbane, and we'll see that with the creation of her front bench in the coming week or so. But it's a real challenge. They don't have a deep bench in metropolitan areas, and that's difficult to run campaigns in the cities. It'll be interesting to see what people like Tim Wilson and potentially Giselle Capterian do if they make it into Parliament.
Yeah. Ellen, the split in the vote for the leadership was quite interesting. Susan Lee won with 29 votes, Angus Taylor 25. Dave Sharma earlier in the week said that he was worried if it would be a tight vote, what it could mean for the party, for the unity for the party. Do you think she's in danger here if the next couple of years, don't necessarily go well?
I think there's a lot of work to do in the short term, and it will be a real test for the coalition to see how willing they are to give her support as she kind of tries to rebuild the coalition and especially the Liberal Party out of what has been such a horrible defeat for the party. I think the split in the leadership vote more broadly speaks to how divided the party is, and what Susan Lee needs to do is kind of try and forge a way forward. And that's not just within the Liberal Party, that's within the coalition more broadly. And we've seen, a lot of loud debate this week about whether there is a future for the coalition, and there's a real divide over net zero and nuclear energy especially. And that goes back to Tom's point before. Susan Lee has a really tough job ahead of trying to win back those city seats where, net zero and having a position on net zero is crucial to win back votes, while also trying to keep some of the more conservative Nationals MPs especially happy.
What do you make of this idea? I do want to get to net zero, but of this idea of her being put on the glass cliff?
Yeah, I find this a really interesting conversation. As we've said, much of the front bench got wiped out. Susan Lee was the deputy under Peter Dutton. She and Angus Taylor were the front runners. I think, she doesn't want people to dwell so much on the symbolism, she says, of her being the first woman to lead the party in 80 years. It is significant, and it does speak to, the Liberal Party knows it has a woman problem, and having Susan Lee in a position of power, I think recognises that. But I think this this conversation around the glass cliff, I mean, she has tried to distance herself from it. She doesn't believe that's the case. But, I mean, only time will tell. Only time will tell.
Yeah. Let's get on to net zero. Obviously, there's a massive divide here within the coalition. We know that its policy is now going to be up for review. There are some within the Nationals actively campaigning for the coalition to drop this policy. Do you think that the coalition can take a credible climate change policy to the next election without a target of at least, net zero by 2050?
I think if they abandon net zero, it's going to be a sign of a real fracture within the coalition, and it'll be a return to pretty heady climate wars in that section of the parliament, potentially more broadly. I think if you consider net zero and the nuclear policy as two sides of the same coin, probably they need to keep both if they're going to keep one or other. The Nationals have an extra position on the coalition front bench in exchange for their support for net zero. Does that go away if the coalition drops it? That will be interesting to find out. I think energy and emissions and climate in general are probably some of the most complex areas that Susan Lee and David Littleproud are going to have to fight it out over. I think a lot of voters will see it as a credibility test, and I think internationally it's definitely a credibility test. Net zero is accepted. That's the area that the world is moving towards. The coalition would look like laggards, I think, if they ditch it.
Ellen, what does it mean then for the nuclear policy as well? We know this emphatic defeat for the coalition also can be attributed to how unpopular that policy was.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of kind of rhetoric at the moment about, the coalition has suffered such a defeat that it's hard to see them back in government anytime soon. And if we assume that, it might not be for 3, 6, 9 years until they're back in power, the world will have changed a lot and it might have been too late to start nuclear. I think, there's been some conversation about maybe less about a coalition policy on nationalised nuclear and more about letting the market take control. I think that could be more, that could prove more popular. But I think, it's a difficult issue for them to weather over as they try and formulate what the future of the coalition looks like.
On Monday, it feels like it's been a long week. On Monday, Labor also unveiled its new front bench, and obviously we saw the fallout from that factional deal that saw Ed Husic and Mark Dreyfus dumped from the front bench. It was pretty untidy, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and I think it took some of the shine away from Labor's really emphatic victory. Ed Husic on Insiders on the weekend and then on Q&A on Monday night still talking about it. He's obviously deeply, deeply unhappy with how it all went down. Mark Dreyfus, on the other hand, hasn't really said anything. But I think, the PM has tried to keep his distance from this. Richard Marles, who was labelled a factional assassin by Ed Husic, has tried to put some has denied that characterisation. But I think, it is part of the Labor process. I think a lot of Australians didn't recognise how messy the democratic process could be, and that's now on full display.
Yeah, and Jim Chalmers admitted it was a pretty messy way that they went about it. Another factional factor was we saw Tanya Plibersek move to social services, now replaced in environment with Murray Watt. Obviously, she has been a long-time factional rival for Anthony Albanese. But what do you think that move, Tom, says around the, focus Anthony Albanese wants to put on that portfolio and nature-positive laws?
Yeah, I think Tanya Plibersek had been undercut in that role, and at the end of the last parliament, the PM put the kibosh on a deal with the Greens for nature positive. It was untenable for her to stay. However, I think putting Murray Watt in the portfolio is a fascinating move. It shows that the PM really wants to get these nature positive laws through, get the Federal Environment Protection Agency established. I think he's bringing real energy and drive towards that goal, and we'll probably see it be a big feature of the next 6 and 12 months. So that will kind of deal with the policy problem and the political problem that the government's got there. That being said, Tanya Plibersek's a real energy source for the government. She's widely admired by voters and people really like her across the parliament. I'll be fascinated to see what she does with her new portfolio. I think she's extremely capable. So yeah, it could be a good move in both senses. I do think she was badly undercut as Environment Minister.
And we saw how prominent she was also during the campaign, not nationally, but going to a lot of those seats for Labor backbenchers. Ellen, just quickly on the Greens leadership, Larissa Waters, this also comes into play now with the negotiations for Nature Positive. Do you think that the Greens might now have a different approach given their result at the election?
Yeah, she's pledged to be a bit more. I'm just trying to find the quote. She's pledged to be a bit more cooperative and work collaborative than maybe her predecessor was. You know, she wants. Obviously, the Greens are in the sole balance of power in the Senate. They have said to Labor that they have a real opportunity to make some real changes. I think we will see two Queenslanders, you know, from a resource-rich state. It will be very interesting to see how that dynamic kind of plays out between Larissa Waters and Murray Watt. But I think, you know, there is an appetite for the Greens to get back to some of the more environmental roots at the root of the party. And there's been a lot of talk about that this week as well.
Tom, do you think there's any prospect of the Greens just being completely sidelined here with Nature Positive and some kind of deal being done with the coalition?
I think that's probably unlikely. I mean, it'll be interesting to see who Murray Watt negotiates with first, who he meets with first in terms of environmental and industry stakeholders. I think the Greens and Labor in this term in the Senate is going to be the place to watch. You know, Anthony Albanese's style will be on show, his ability to make deals. The Greens want to push Labor in a lot of areas. Labor resists that quite a lot and feels a bit of animus towards the Greens still. So yeah, my sense is that the Greens are probably more likely, but there'll be any number of policy areas where they might look to make a deal with the coalition instead of going to the crossbench.
It's been a big week. Ellen Ransley, Tom McElroy, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Pablo.
Thanks, Pablo.
The acting Prime Minister has rejected suggestions that Labor will undershoot its 2030 renewable energy target. Energy analysts and industry groups warn the government will fall short of the target by 14 percentage points due to delays in delivering big solar and wind projects. Richard Marles says Labor is confident it can meet the targets.
What we have done over the last 3 years is unlock investment in renewable energy, and we are seeing massive investment in renewable energy around the country now. Renewable energy, firmed by gas, firmed by batteries, firmed by hydro, is ultimately the pathway by which we achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and we transition our economy to being a much more modern, high-tech economy. We're on track to do that, and we're on track to do that because we're pursuing consistent energy policy.
The New South Wales Hunter region was in the focus during the election campaign, with an abundance of local energy projects proposed to help it transition from coal. While the coalition was tipped to potentially pick up some seats in the area, the Hunter, Paterson, Newcastle and Shortland electorates all had swings towards Labor. Joining us now to discuss this is the CEO of Business Hunter, Bob Hawes. Bob Hawes, thanks so much for your time.
No problem, Pablo.
Firstly, before the election, we saw that there was a lot of expectation, even amongst some in Labor, that it could face significant swings in the Hunter. Now, we've obviously seen the opposite. You're obviously a local there. Why do you think the region swung in so strongly behind Labor?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion about what the future could look like, particularly in the energy sector up here. And, you know, we are really at the central part of that, not only in terms of our historic capacity to generate power for the good folk of New South Wales and Australia, but also, as you say, what sort of future we can carve out in terms of the renewable energy and the offshore wind project, the licence area that had been created by the federal government. We had proponents sitting there that had been offered the opportunity to move forward with the licence, but they were sitting on their hands waiting to see what the outcome of the election was. And, you know, there was great uncertainty about that, and that also extended to other onshore renewable projects in the Central West and New England Northwest. So obviously the people here in the Hunter, when they got into the ballot box, that wasn't as an important issue as some other things that they might have taken personally to do perhaps with the cost of living and other things. But energy still remains a hot topic here in the Hunter.
I want to get to that point you make around confidence and certainty in a minute, but was the Coalition's nuclear policy broadly damaging in the region, do you think?
Well, I think it was divisive up here. There wasn't, the information that we were getting, it was hard to fathom for the general community, for the vast and the wide difference in the gap between the two propositions that were being put to the region. And one was, I guess, the more generally accepted and known pathway on renewables that are already being carved out over the last 10 to 15 years versus a change to what that pathway was. And that was confusing and, as I say, difficult for people generally to speaking to get information, since the information sources that we were getting were miles apart. There was very little bipartisanship or collaboration on the message being given to the community, other than a particular pathway was the right one, and that was very destabilising to say the least. And Business Hunter and other groups up here had been craving for bipartisanship on the energy call, so that communities did have certainty in the pathway forward.
What about renewable energy projects and the impact that they've had in the region? We know that new transmission lines there have been polarising in some communities. How have you seen, or how are you seeing that play out in the community?
Yeah, there's a lot of work still to be done there, that's for sure. If we had our time again, perhaps government and the community would be facing those prospects of what we're trying to do there differently. And there's no doubt there's still a lot of work to do to get that right. But having said that, joining those dots across, what is essentially attracting the private sector to invest in those renewable energy projects, while the government does what it needs to do, or what it's trying to do in connecting the dots with transmission projects. And then thirdly, how the community accepts that. It's a massive amount of change very quickly, and that is always difficult for communities, particularly across the Hunter region, where even though we are in and of ourselves are a large economic region by Australian standards, some of those communities in which these projects are being considered are quite small, and the projects by their scale are very large. So a lot of work to do, but I think to give credit to the New South Wales government, where they had bipartisanship for their energy roadmap. They're seeking to deliver that, and they've got agencies now working hard and listening to people, but there can always be more of that, to try and get that right, given the timetable and the pathway that we've got and very, very steep hills we've got to climb, as it were, to get to that renewable energy future. We do have a long way to go, there's no doubt about that.
And you've made that point that the Hunter region is, in your view, poised to step up as a regional powerhouse, but that it needs confidence and investment in the environment for that economic pathway. So do you believe, after such a decisive vote, that the certainty is there now that the government has a mandate to continue with its approach on renewables?
Certainly hope so. I think the continuity and the certainty that it provides in getting the mandate that it did should give them some assurance and some confidence to move forward. And there was a lot of destabilising factors, and some of those were sort of under the radar to some extent. And for example, if the coalition had got in, we understand that some of the agencies up here that are active in that energy and what will happen in the new facilitation for a new future up here might have been disbanded. So that sort of stalling, I guess, that could have been put into the progress that we were looking here would have been destabilising. But it's quite clear that the private sector can't do this by themselves. The government can't do this by themselves because of the situation we're in with trying to deliver the overall energy package, and the community somewhere in the middle wondering where this is all going to lead to. So we really do have to work together collaboratively and as sincerely and as transparently as we possibly can, given the short time to 2030 when some of these targets that we're aiming for have been set, and then ultimately what 2050 looks like into the long-term future.
Yeah, okay. You just said that we need to work together collaboratively collaboratively. It's been a long week. We're seeing the coalition now review the future of its net zero emissions by 2050. Does that give you confidence then that the climate wars are over?
Not really. Once again, craving bipartisanship on some of these big picture elements. I mean, it's targets are one thing, and government setting those and then relying on a lot of industry and business to deliver on them is another thing. So, you know, if we get these targets and we have them set and agreed to, that is a far more better position to be in than having government or the parties in government disagree on what that pathway looks like. So, no, it's not very helpful to have that lack of bipartisanship on important measures like that, given I think it's generally accepted that even in communities like the Hunter, where people have associated with the long term of the coal-fired power industry to moving to renewables, acceptance by industry in the community to take that pathway, and we really do look for leadership to make sure that what we're all working towards is being aimed at together and not drifting off in different variables based on different positions taken by the respective parties.
Okay, Bob Halls, we'll have to leave it there, but we appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Pablo.
The Liberals have elected their first female leader in Susan Lee, but questions continue to be asked about if they are connecting with female voters. Christy McSweeney is the founder of the PR Council and a former Liberal Party political advisor, and she joins us now. Christy McSweeney, thank you so much for your time.
Lovely to be here.
You've written a piece in the AFR saying that the Liberals need a Menzian mandate to back female candidates. What do you mean by that?
Look, I've said that because unbeknownst to many people, Menzies actually established the Liberal Party of Australia with a vision to enshrine mandated gender spots for women in the administration of the Liberal Party, which meant at a time when women couldn't work when they were married or couldn't get a bank account or couldn't get a financial loan, they were able to hold senior positions in the Liberal Party. And we have that to this day with female vice president, female member elected of chairs of positions in our party. So it's not a large stretch when we hear people who make this argument, this blanket argument about merit, which doesn't unpack many of the structures in our party that has led to the electoral reality that women in our party are not working and raising families like they are in the Labor Party. Those structures need to be unpacked. We need to answer the questions of why our party differs in the way it looks to Australian women to the Labor Party. But we can't say it's not in the spirit of Menzies because it is. That's how he set up the party.
So why do you think that resistance exists still against, things like quotas when clearly we're seeing this is now the second election, the party going backwards with female support and females in the party?
Well, I'll make the point that I didn't call for a quota, a blanket quota in the way that Labor does it. That's Labor's way. That's Labor's way that extends the union horse trading of how they appoint people to their positions. That's not the Liberal Party's way. I've called for us to look at it, for us to create our own quota or our own system, not Labor's quota, that is fit for purpose for us. Is it 50% of seats for 5 years? Is it everything for 10 years? I think the experiment is worth the outcome. The house is burnt down. We can't rebuild it in exactly the way it was. Yes, we can take those values and certainly we need to get our economic narrative right and we need to speak to women in a better, clearer way about issues that they care about, which of course is the economy and security and defence, but they also care about things that are directly affecting them. And we didn't communicate that properly and we didn't use women to communicate that, despite the fact that our whole Senate leadership team is women. So women weren't visible in our campaign, but there's an electoral reality that there are just not enough of them and they are not visible to the Australian voter and to the female Australian voter as a party that perhaps more reflects what the community reflects.
On the election more broadly, then you're a former Liberal staffer. What do you think went wrong for the party?
Look, I first went to Canberra in 2004. I've worked on many, many campaigns at CHQ. I've worked for many state and federal leaders and cabinet ministers. So I come as a credible voice. I think it's a reality that we didn't pursue a policy agenda from 12 to 18 months out. I will say that Peter Dutton, as an opposition leader, did a very good job getting to the coalition to a position where the polls were 50-50. And they were all polls, not just our internal polling, which has certainly turned out to be something that we should dismiss, but all polls around the end of last year was that, you know, Australians didn't hate Peter Dutton, Australians didn't hate the Liberal Party. But I think the campaign was chaotic. I think a lot of policy that shadow front benches had done some really good work on, including women's health, building on the menopause commitment that the coalition made, including education, including immigration. And a lot of those policies were done by senior women in the shadow cabinet. A lot of those policies were put in the drawer. So therefore, we didn't reveal those policies, and the policies we did reveal were too late and not communicated properly. And I think that speaks to the lack of diversity of people around the table, either willing to argue the case against the leader and the decisions that he made, not taking away from the amazing contribution that he made, or that people simply were not, putting forward those policies. But I know a lot of people did.
What do you make of this idea around Susan Lee being put on the glass cliff now? Obviously a significant milestone that the Liberal Party has elected its first female leader, but at a time where it's just suffered a catastrophic defeat.
Look, I don't like to use that term. It has been a wonderful moment for the coalition to elect the first female leader of the coalition, the Liberal Party, my party's part of the coalition, to elect a first female leader at a federal level in history. We've had state leaders lead the Liberal Party. The Senate leadership team is female. So it's not like the Liberal Party hasn't appointed women to senior positions. But I think this is a sensible decision, and it's a sensible start to demonstrating to Australia that perhaps we are moving forward a little bit in terms of how we communicate, how we talk to voters, and how we want to reflect that we look more like the Australia that they look at every day in their communities and in their workplaces.
Okay, Christy McSweeney, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
The days of media moguls deciding Australian elections are apparently over, according to new research from the Australia Institute. Report co-author Joshua Black joins me now in the studio. Josh, thank you for your time.
Good afternoon.
I guess I should be pretty worried if you're saying the days of legacy media are over.
Well, I mean, there will continue to be a role for public broadcasters in a cluttered and crowded media landscape like the one we have at the moment. But more generally, the results of the 2025 election very clearly show us that the influence of what were once Australia's very powerful media dynasties, that influence is declining. And the path is very clearly open to Australia's leaders, Australia's parliamentarians, to pursue a much bolder, more ambitious kind of politics if they so choose.
What have you made of traditional media's roles or legacy media's role in this last election in particular? What have you found?
Well, in the last two elections particularly, the voters clearly defied the messages that they were getting from the major media companies in their newspaper endorsements on election eve. So for a period of about 30 years, at almost every Australian federal election, the majority of newspapers officially endorsed the winning party. That wasn't the case in 2022, and it certainly wasn't the case at this election, where less than a third of Australia's major newspapers endorsed the Albanese government on election eve. So clearly, I mean, that's one very obvious indicator where we see media influence declining quite in a marked way.
I remember being on the campaign when the endorsements came out for just this recent election, and some were, I think, made the point quite reluctantly backing Peter Dutton and the coalition. So what do you think it is? Is it the fact that these media outlets aren't getting the same reach, aren't getting the same audience, or is it more that people just are not taking in what they're saying?
I think it's predominantly the former. I mean, these newspapers, which used to have an enormous reach in the community, are struggling to match the reach of, say, an influential influencer or TikToker. I mean, we made some estimates about numbers in Victoria, which was a very key state at this election. I mean, all of the commentators were saying that the coalition's path to victory depended on victories in suburban seats in Victoria. And what we saw was that a single TikTok from an influencer like Abby Chatfield was able to very quickly attract about 600,000 views. That's around 2/3 of what we estimate the average Monday to Friday readership of a Nine or a News Corp newspaper in Victoria to be. That's really significant. That means that the concentration of attention in crucial battleground areas is no longer captured by formerly powerful media companies.
What about, though, their reach online? Obviously, a lot of, all of them now have a very strong online presence. Is that resonating?
I wouldn't say that it's resonating. It matters. It certainly matters that traditional newsprint media has its online presence, and they've got the resources to be able to make that presence work for them in some capacity. But the online news landscape is far more crowded, far more diverse, and the barriers to entry are significantly lower. And that's why we're saying that the era of newspapers has not finished. They haven't been completely displaced, but nor are they the formerly powerful titans that they once were in shaping the political conversation from, morning till night, from dawn till dusk.
What about the role of television programs? We often hear during election campaigns that TV debates are very high-stake moments. What have you found there?
Well, that it's not true, I think, is the long and short of it. Once upon a time, they certainly were. The Australian Election Study, which is an important study conducted in the wake of each federal election, it found that in about 1993, roughly 70% of viewers, 70% of voters said that they watched at least one of the leaders' debates. By our estimates, at the most recent election, we know that there were 4 debates. The most significant of those debates managed to attract a maximum of about 12% of voters, and that's an optimistic maximum. That's really significant. That means that platforms such as the ABC's Vote Compass were pretty much as significant as some leaders' debates in engaging the public, in helping people figure out what their values are, how they graft onto the political landscape around them, and how they would orient their vote on polling day. I think that's really significant.
What do we know about the role of influencers? You mentioned some just then, and podcasters. How significant do you think they are now in this landscape?
Extremely significant, and that's partly why so much attention was focused on the role of podcasters and influencers at the previous election. We saw some disagreements at the very beginning of the campaign about whether a podcaster's interview with a political leader constitutes an endorsement or not, whether it constitutes advertising or not, and the financial relationships behind these things came under enormous scrutiny. And I think that what that shows is that this is, I think, one of the first of the podcasters' elections that we're going to see in Australia in the 2020s and beyond.
Do you think this benefits political parties, though, because these podcasters aren't necessarily journalists and some, admit they are activists?
Well, I suppose political parties will conduct their reviews post-election and try to make judgments about whether it worked to their benefit or not. But as for whether it's valuable for democracy, I think it's incredibly useful if people can engage with their leaders in some capacity, and if that's through a direct podcast where they can listen to what their leaders are saying directly, or if that's in the TikTok sphere where messages need to be curated and produced in a particular way, anything that engages Australian voters with their electoral process, I think is a really valuable thing, provided that the laws around them are working effectively.
Josh, just lastly and very quickly, do you think we're seeing the campaign kind of roll out here as it did in the US, that kind of fractured landscape?
Political fragmentation is a global phenomenon, but I think we're seeing something different here, which is a recovery in the federal government's primary vote. I mean, that's significant. And Australia's preferential voting system kind of acts as a bulwark against some of that fragmentation. It means that no matter which electorate you live in, you can be confident that of the final two candidates in that race, the majority of people in that electorate preferred the person who got elected. So I think that there are safeguards in Australia's electoral systems that help.
Okay, Joshua Black, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Pablo.
That's afternoon briefing for today. Stay with us here on the ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. See you soon.